Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out in the direction of Kherson, where we see that the Ukrainian forces launched a attack across the Dnipro River, where they actually managed to reach the outskirts of Poima and Pishanivka, after which they crossed the Dnieper River, launching these assaults, and then the Russian forces launched a counterattack, pushing them back towards the islands in the center across the lakes. So there's been some heavy fighting in this direction as the Ukrainian forces demonstrated their ability to cross the Dnieper River and actually reach the opposite shoreline. We have seen them previously launch attacks across the middle islands, but this is the second time they actually managed to reach the outskirts of villages across the Dnieper River. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces may still be planning a Dnieper crossing, launching a major attack across the Dnieper River, similar to what was expected at the start of the war. As we see currently, the Ukrainian offensive has not yielded any major success so far, so they're trying to see and test different areas to see if they're able to scavenge the situation and gain some sort of victory despite the 5 months of the offensive yielding little to no results. We're seeing here in the Zaporizhia front, we see that the Ukrainian forces continue to pressure the Russian forces, and they also launched attacks towards Novoprokopivka and Verbove, but the Russian forces continue counterattacking. The current situation is that the Ukrainian forces are trying to hold on to their positions across the Russian first line of defense, while the Russian forces are constantly attacking their positions from the south and from the east, trying to push them out of the trenches and subsequently pushing them away from the first main line of defense. We then move further north in the direction of Melnigivka, where the Russian forces managed to advance slightly here to the west of Novoslatopil. So these two villages are areas that hasn't seen a lot of fighting over the past few weeks and months of the Ukrainian offensive, but we're now seeing that the Russian forces are trying to take local advantages whenever possible. We also saw some fighting by Medvopil a couple of weeks ago. So with this, we see that there is some fighting here in this direction towards Holyapole. As for the southern parts of Donetsk, we see that the Russian forces pushed in the direction of Novomikhailivka, where we here see that they have been pushing both to the south and to the north of the village now, meaning that they're likely trying to do some sort of pincer maneuver, attacking Novomikhailivka from both the north and the south. Due to the length of the village, it is the tactic that makes the most sense, attacking it from the flanks, possibly cutting it off, separating it from each other, and as such pushing the Ukrainian forces back. So far we're seeing that there's some pressure on the southern and northern sides, which would indicate that the fighting here to the north by the Ukrainian side trying to counterattack is to relieve the pressure of the northern side, because the Russians have advanced much more on the southern than in the northern side, which would mean that the Ukrainian forces trying to hold a position where they have a stronger flank here to the north and a weaker one to the south, drawing in the Russian forces to the south, after which they'll relocate their forces to counterattack in the south. So there's some sort of a tactic being used here, trying to face off the Russian forces, while the Russian forces have in turn destroyed the bridge here by Konstantinivka. So with this, we see that the Russian forces are here planning to capture these villages by cutting off their supplies and then storming them. So most likely we'll see some further attacks on the direction of Novomikhailivka, and the Ukrainian forces will most likely direct some more forces in this direction, considering the Russian pressure. As for the northern parts of Donetsk in the direction of Avdiivka, the Russian offensive continues as they attempt to advance in both the southern and northern parts of the city. From the latest updates, the Russian forces haven't advanced further. There's been a lot of fighting, especially here in the northern parts, where we see that the Russian forces are using a combination of armored vehicles and massive artillery fire to try to advance slowly, both in the northern and the southern fields here to the west of Krasnohorivka. So we see here a lot of heavy fighting over this area to the east of the railway, trying to cross over in the direction of Stepova and Berdishi, while the Ukrainian forces have sent a lot of reinforcements to the Avdiivka direction. So with this, they are able to better face off the Russian forces. And in relation to this, Deep State map raises the question, is it now the end of armored assaults? Because we have seen both the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces consistently fail across the whole war. We see now this picture here, which shows about 63 Russian armored vehicles destroyed. So they raised this question: is it the end of armored pushes in modern warfare? And my argument is that it is not yet. The reason for this is when we compare what we see now to the last time where we've seen major successes with these armored vehicles, the major difference we see is that with the amount of reconnaissance drones that we now have available in modern warfare, it is hard to stay undetected for a long time. But historically speaking, this is a bad argument because although, yes, we now have better reconnaissance, we're able to detect them earlier, we're able to deal with them earlier, that is indeed a major change, but it is not something that will completely change the way of warfare. Instead, what I believe is the biggest difference between last time we saw major breakthroughs with armored columns compared to today is the element of quantity. We see today that most of these assaults end up with 20 to 30 tanks all in one column, and then they spread out to cover massive areas. For example, here in Krasnohorivka, we had 20 to 30 tanks, and they have essentially been spent up in this whole area over a week's time. In comparison, we see in World War II that there were tens of tanks, 20, 30, 40, 50 tanks. Like in these pictures here, we see about 20 tanks, even more, caught in this poor footage from World War II. This is authentic footage from World War II. And all of them are located in one small field, driving at the same time, at the same point. This is all compared with the footage we got from this specific offensive. We saw that there were about 5 to 10 in this direction towards the railways. We saw there was a couple in this direction towards the hill, and we saw that there were some in the southern side, and we have seen losses all across this whole area. They're all spread apart, but in World War II scenario, they would have 20 to 30 in this direction, 20 to 30 in this direction, 20 to 30 in this direction, and suddenly we have over 100 tanks. That is 3 times as much. And in cases like the Battle of Kursk, we had approximately, as is seen on the wiki page, 3,000 tanks against 7,000 tanks. That is 10,500 tanks in a single battle on one city, and approximately 2.7 million soldiers. So we are seeing that there is massive difference in quantity. Why is this so different? Because we also see, for example, here 2,000 aircraft against up to 3,500 aircraft. That's 5,500 aircraft, yet we are seeing approximately 100 aircraft today. That is significantly less than even a fraction of what we saw in World War II. If we take a look at this picture here, we see approximately 27 aircraft flying side by side. If we had today 100 aircraft and 100 tanks north of Krasnohorivka, you best believe me that although the Russians would take 50 losses of each of them, they will definitely take the city. They'll definitely take the whole area. Yet people believe that it is the end of armored warfare because the best they can muster up is 20 tanks. That is clearly not the case. We saw at the very start of the Russian invasion, they managed to take huge swaths of land with these armored columns. Then your argument may be, well, the Ukrainians didn't have fortifications, they weren't prepared, so on. Yes, they did. They didn't have the quantity to deal with the Russian invasion, and sure enough, they didn't know when exactly they were going to attack. But they had been talking about a Russian buildup and a Russian attack for over a year, so they had over a year to prepare. It is simply excuses. So what we're seeing is that it is definitely not the end of armored vehicles, armored tanks, launching breakthrough maneuvers, but it is definitely a time where we do not see any major buildups, whether it be because they are scared that they're going to lose everything in a one single offensive. They don't want to risk it all. But in the end, if they cannot manage to muster up enough vehicles, then they are not going to see any breakthroughs on the front line. This is a battle of attrition. What we're seeing is that both sides are spending so much time and so little resources on every single part of the front line. If either side gathered enough troops at one point and then launched a massive attack at that point, then they're most likely going to see success, more success than we have seen all throughout 2023. However, the issue is neither side is able to do that, and if they lose it, if they lose the armored vehicle, if they lose the column, if they lose the manpower necessary, then they're not able to deal with the aftermath. That is why we're not seeing it. We're seeing this very slow grind with the Ukrainian offensive over 5 months, still haven't used up their 100,000 soldiers. That is because they didn't decide to do it on the first day. If they used 100,000 soldiers and the hundreds of tanks that they had prepared for this offensive, then I bet you they probably have reached Melitopol. They've probably reached Berdyansk by now. However, it would end with a Russian counterattack that probably took Zaporizhia because the Ukrainian army would be decimated. That is why they didn't do it. However, this is not a success either. Just because neither side has made any advances, we in the end see just the casualties. So the casualties are the same, despite using 5 months. But the difference is in these 5 months they've built up the next army. So the only thing that is different is that they're using so much time that they end up building another army. So instead of ending the war tomorrow, they decide to just wait until neither side can continue building up a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth army. This is at a huge cost of life and time and economy and everything else. But in the end, this is the safest way to avoid losing the war. And with the Ukrainians having Western support, they have an interest in extending the war. And with the Russians being completely unprepared for warfare, as we saw at the start of the invasion, they also have an interest in taking their time, learning how to fight, and so on for future wars. So the Russians are doing this, extending the war to learn and improve the quality of their soldiers and equipment for future wars. The Ukrainians are doing it in hopes that at some point the West sends enough equipment, training, so on, for them to actually beat the Russians. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.